AI and the Epistemology of Education. I also want to thank Duncan for being sponsoring through the Center for Knowledge, Technology and Society, and also his big grant from John Templeton Foundation. Is really the title of the project, or just in or
no,
Intellectual Virtues? He's been sponsoring the day, his workshop at least. Maybe there will be more today. Everything seems to be happening today anyway. So without any further ado, Duncan, take it away.
Thanks very much, Lisa. So yeah, we're going to talk about AI and epistemology of education. I should warn you on the other previous two talks, this is less of a talk than a manifesto. So buckle in. I'm going to try and do it in 20 minutes because that's what thought would be the way to structure it.
That's always something.
It was working. I said it, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, here you go.
Okay.
Okay, so everyone's getting very anxious about AI and societal implications. I think they're right to be anxious, but I think maybe the reasons why we should be anxious, the reason why I think we should be anxious, the reason why a lot of other people should be anxious aren't quite the same. And that's partly because I think the AI is being heavily misrepresented, what it can do, what it is, largely because it's being driven, I think, by trying to increase share value. I want to set out what I think the real challenge of AI might be. I'm going to talk a bit about the societal implications, but what I really want to focus on is implications for education, and I'll just focus on higher education. The risk of being a sort of Pollyanna, I want to try and defend the thesis that it might be a blessing in disguise, even though I think it is going to have some dreadful societal implications. So only in one respect, a blessing in disguise, and that it could help us to see what's really important about education, to recognize that, and to rid ourselves finally of a dreary conception of education, which I think has become ascendant in the contemporary life. A bit of background. By AI, I mean LLMs, right? Because that's the thing everyone's getting excited about. And it's important to this talk that I say a little bit about why I don't think much of the LLMs, even though they are, in some respects, very impressive. I think they betray the true spirit of AI. And in this, I follow Chomsky. The original aim of AI was to try and understand what's so incredible about human cognition, human intelligence, which is phenomenal, as I'm going to say about in a minute. Instead, what the LLMs do, although they're doing very well, is they basically plagiarize us. They use big data to mimic us. So it looks like they're doing like intelligent things, so actually all they're doing is mimicking us, using data about us to mimic us. Now, I think the LLMs are going to be, don't get me wrong, I think they're going to revolutionize a lot of things. They're going to change a lot of things, and we should be aware of that. But I think what it's doing is often misrepresented. And I think, in particular, it's not doing the sorts of things that it's advertised as doing. This is important. Can I just take a vote before I get to the next slide? Put your hand up if you know what behavioral modernity is.
Behavioral?
Behavioral modernity. Anybody know what it is? Okay, I'm not surprised. Behavioral modernity is astonishing. It's the sort of thing that should be taught in schools in the way we teach Newton. I only came across it in my 30s. It's effectively our origin story. It's an anthropological stage. It occurs in the Upper Paleolithic period. We can date it pretty precisely. It's about 50,000 years ago. And it's the point at which Homo sapiens stopped behaving like primates and started behaving like we do now. In particular, we went from being the sort of creatures which lived in small groups, very limited tool use, very limited communication, no language, no abstract thought, no art, to being the kind of creatures that could exist in large groups. Massive explosion in tool use, you get art, abstract thought, cave paintings, things like that start to occur. Communication becomes more sophisticated, you get early language. And everything that's important about us follows from that moment, right? The early civilizations along the Nile would never have happened because we wouldn't be able to live in large groups. To have civilizations, you have large groupings, so you get specializations. The linguistic abilities that come with this behavioral modernity, they're able to do all kinds of incredible things. For example, Homo sapiens have made it into Europe previously, but it never stuck. You just can't do it in small groups. But now there's the new migrations going to Europe and the new civilizations get founded, and civilizations in Tigris and Euphrates along the banks of the Indus and so on. This is everything about us that makes us special comes from this moment. And like Chomsky, I mean, Chomsky's big point about this is that really it's the capacity behind our linguistic abilities, the sort of structures that are in there, that's what's being triggered in behavioral modernity. And that's what's special about us as cognitive beings. We're elegant explanation machines. We're geared towards truth. That doesn't mean we're not irrational, of course we are, but we're fundamentally geared towards the truth. We're able to pick out relevant, there's massive amounts of data available to us, but we're able to pick out the relevant, because we've got these structures in our mind, the relevant amount of data so we can create these explanations. And then our language abilities are quite phenomenal. There's nothing like them anywhere else in the animal kingdom. A 4-year-old can understand an unlimited number of sentences. I mean, that's an incredible thing. Moreover, we talk about teaching a first language. One of the insights of the Chomsky program is that really that's a misnomer. Just take a child, put them in a linguistic community and do nothing. By 4, they'll be able to speak an unlimited number of sentences. And this is the key feature about human intelligence and what's so incredible about it. And what's even more amazing and mind-blowing about behavioral modernity is that we don't really understand what happened. I mean, we know that it happened. We know roughly where it happened, and we can date it fairly precisely. We know it happens over the space of a few thousand years. The fact that it happened so quickly in evolutionary terms means that it wasn't selected for. We know that. That doesn't mean it was magic. What must have happened is something else was selected for. And then, like what they call spandrels, like a side effect of this, we got these capacities, and which something in the environment must have triggered them. At this point, no one knows various hypotheses, but no one really knows why. And what's even more bizarre about this, there's no physical change. Our brains have been the same for like 250,000 years. You know, physically, there's no difference. So it's not like, and indeed, it doesn't even look like there would be, you know, for this to be selected for, you'd have to be a short to medium term evolutionary advantage. Not even clear there is. Obviously, there's a long term advantage, but there doesn't seem to be a short term advantage. So it may not be the kind of thing that could be selected for. So it's kind of like lucky, really, that we've ended up being these very special creatures that we are. But if we want to understand what we are, we have to go through, understanding what intelligence is, what it really is really about, I think, fundamentally understanding what's special about human intelligence. And once you start to realize what's incredible about human intelligence, you realize the LLMs really, although they're very impressive, and they're impressive because they're mimicking us, in a very fundamental sense, they're also quite dumb. They're not geared towards explanation. They're not geared towards truth. What they're doing looks impressive just because it's taken our data of our behaviors and it's using it to mimic us. And we need to bear that in mind when we think about the LLMs. So I think we should be a little skeptical about some of the rhetoric. We're a lot smarter than we give ourselves credit, and the LLMs are actually much dumber than they appear. And we have to keep reminding, because they appear smart. They appear smart like us. We have to keep reminding ourselves they're not doing what we're doing. And you can see that, by the way, when they make mistakes, because their mistakes are usually egregious mistakes, because they're on some fundamental level, they're not doing what we're doing, the mistakes are going to be a lot bigger. Now, none of that means that they're not going to transform the world. I think they are, and I think we should be very worried about them, but not worried about them because I think they're going to become conscious, they're going to become our overlords or something like that. I do a lot of podcast interviews. People always want to ask me about this, like singularities and when the machine's going to take over. I don't think Terminator-like scenarios are very plausible with LLMs. But I actually think the worry is rather more prosaic, right? I've read my Marx, right? Marx talks about the internal contradictions in capitalism, and one of which, and how it's going to bring down capitalism. And I'll give you a rough, potted description of this, right? So you have the industrialists, they've got their machines. Every industrialist is motivated to lay off labor, get more machines, because that way they can reduce their costs, they get more profits. Having a large unemployed labor force is great for industrialists because it depresses labor costs, right? So and more profits, so there's a virtuous cycle. But at a certain point, capitalism enters into a doom loop. You've gone past the point of no return. Now you've got mass unemployment. No one buying the products that the machines are making. And plus, you've got this, the social unrest that comes from the large-scale employment and the revolution ensues. This never happened with industrial society. I mean, all the communist revolutions have all been in a pre-industrialized state. So it never happened with industrialized states. So we never know, we never really saw this in action. It's a really interesting question why it never happened. The historians have various explanations of this. I mean, one might be it took longer, the process takes longer than Marx anticipated. Another is that it's happening within a single country, it's not happening globally. The time difference means you get there's time for positive feedback loops to kick in to mitigate against the effects of some. But what the worry for me about AI is that something like what I just described, industrialization, could happen right now, but it could happen globally, very fast, all at once, and I don't see any way there'd be time to get the positive feedback loops, and suddenly lots of people are unemployed, suddenly there's social unrest and so on. So I think that's the real source of the anxiety for AI. But I'm not going to talk about that. I want to talk about something else. It's connected though, AI and education, right? So one argument you hear a lot now, in fact, we were just talking about it at lunch, is that the AI is coming for us. It's going to kill us. On two levels. Why have teachers, right? Why do you need Duncan Pritchard to teach an epistemology course, right? The AI can just read through lots of epistemology textbooks and come up with a course and create an avatar, very much more appealing avatar, and maybe do a much better job. So no need for teachers, right? Because we can offload that to the AI. But in fact, why is there any need even for students, right? That's not even clear, right? Why can't we just offload a lot of things that we're learning now to technology? I think the second point becomes even more pointed once we start to think about AI in conversation with the extended cognition. So Nikolai mentioned extended cognition in his talk. This is the Andy Clark, Dave Chalmers stuff. It's when technology becomes a proper part of a cognitive process. So it's not just simply a user and an instrument, it's actually part of the cognitive process itself. I think it's a real thing. I would set the bar for it a lot higher than people like Andy Clark do. I don't know, notebooks can be extended cognitive process and so on. But I think like neuromedia, having like wearable tech, which is so integrated, seamlessly integrated into your cognitive processes, such that you're not even in the moment aware you're using it, which I think is the way we're going, that would qualify as extended cognition. And if that wearable tech is doing information processing for you, maybe it's, the wearable tech helps you to speak French or something like that. Well, then, yeah, I mean, why learn to speak French, you might say? If you've got the wearable tech, you can just offload the cognitive process to the tech. And then once you start thinking about, well, we do the language, why can't we do that with just about anything? So why learn anything? So universities then, we should shut them up. I think there are legitimate concerns here. I think a lot of what we do right now is going to have to change. But I don't think we should conclude from this that education itself can just be dispensed with. And this brings back to the point that, well, A, we have to remember what the LLMs can do and what they can't do, and B, we have to remember what education is really about. Okay, step back for a minute. The supposed challenge to education from AI, it rests upon a certain picture of what education is, which I think has become quite widespread, if only tacitly held. It's that really the overarching epistemic goal of education is just to give people useful knowledge and skills, what I call elsewhere the bucket model of education, right? Students are buckets and we just fill them up, right? That's our job. And the language used by education reveals this a lot. We talk about students as consumers, educators providing product. We assess education in terms of things like do they prosper in their career? Are they satisfied with their teaching? Student satisfaction back in Britain is a huge thing. So we betray this idea, a very reductive conception of education. And I think if you think that's what education is, just these basic subject-specific knowledge and skills, then sure, the AI is coming for you, because a lot of that can just be uploaded to the AI. But I don't think that is the right way to think about education. The image there, by the way, is of rote learning. Rote learning, I don't know if you know what we talk about, but I don't know what it actually was, very popular in the Victorian period. Student goes off, they memorize something, they come to the forefront, and then they have to recite it to the class. If they get it right, they get some reward. If they get it wrong, they get whacked. And in the Victorian era, it was very popular. And it was actually very effective. If you read Victorian novels, you read Dickens or Thackeray or any author of that historical kind, you'll find there's often they populate their novels with these characters. They're usually because this is the first time in the Victorian period you've got the masses being educated to any significant degree. You have these people, they're butchers or blacksmiths or whatever, but they can recite Shakespeare and things like that. So these characters have gone through the rote learning system, and it's been very effective for them. We got rid of rote learning through bad educational practice, but in a sense, the kind of model that lies behind it, I think, hasn't been got rid of, right? So we still think of it, well, maybe we don't hit students anymore, but we do think that really, fundamentally what we're doing is we're just filling up those buckets. I think this is the wrong way to think about education. Now, education, I'm talking about the epistemic goal of education. So that's consistent with the fact that education serves lots of other roles, social, political, practical. But the epistemic role of education is fundamental in the following sense. A putative educational practice that didn't serve epistemic functions wouldn't be a genuine educational practice at all. So, for example, if you're North Korea and you've got some indoctrination program and you call it education, well, sure, you can use the word, but it isn't really education because it doesn't serve any epistemic goals. Then once we've got that thought in mind, then we can ask ourselves, well, what are the fundamental epistemic goals? Well, the overarching epistemic goals. And I want to suggest that the overarching epistemic goal of education, I think on some deep level, all good educators understand, even if they don't articulate it quite in these terms, it's the development of a certain kind of intellectual exemplar. And that's virtuous intellectual character. It's the integrated set of the subject's intellectual virtue. And these are admirable intellectual character traits, curiosity, intellectual humility, integrity, and so on. Think about the person you admire and the intellectual exemplar that you admire. I bet you will find they have these traits. They're wise people, and they have these admirable intellectual traits. I'll say a little bit about the intellectual virtues. I mean, the model I'm offering here is broadly Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian at least. The intellectual virtues incorporate characteristic motivational state, the love of the truth, the desire to get to the truth. They're required to maintain in a distinctive fashion, via emulation, exemplars, and habituation. They're reflected in their cultivation, not necessarily in their manifestation, right? Because once you've mastered the virtue, it will be second nature to you. But you can't, as it were, just simply absorb the intellectual virtues like you can absorb some other skills. You've got to actually reflect on what you're doing. They lie between two vices, one of excess and deficiency. If you were in the Jason Bear talk yesterday, we talked about curiosity. Curiosity is a trait versus curiosity is a virtue. Curiosity is a virtue, the vice of deficiency would be being incurious. The vice of excess would be being excessively curious, like, so, asking lots of dumb questions. They've got a special kind of value. They enable us to flourish as people. They have a eudaimonic value. Related to that, they promote epistemic autonomy, active knowing and understanding. Virtuous people want to reach out into the world and understand it. They're active knowers. I mean, think about when education is going well. What we don't want at all is the students sort of passively receiving, what you're giving out. When education is done well, it's interactive, it's social, right? They're a participant. And that's what the intellectual virtues help you to do. And then they're integrated. I'll just drop the next one. They perform managerial role in non-cognitive architecture. In particular, they help you to be wise. So they make wise decisions, wise choices. I think you can see the plausibility of the idea that intellectual virtue is central to education by considering the alternative. If you just think that education is about cultivating states and skills, well, you can cultivate that. Maybe the best way to do that is in lots of problematic ways. Ways we think, we used to do it by hitting kids, right? Actually, very effective. I mean, as I said, rote learning, it was effective. We didn't get rid of it because it wasn't effective. We got rid of it because we thought we shouldn't hit kids. But in a sense, we keep something like the rote learning model now. I mean, looking at my kids have just gone through, my oldest kids have just gone through the high school system here. It seems to me the way students think about grades is very similar. They've got this grade obsession, GPA obsession. It's like there's like an endorphin effect they're getting from the grades. And what they learn or delight in learning just drops out the whole process. This is a fixation on grades and credit. So what we're doing effectively, we're just sort of getting the states, but we're actually targeting what we should be targeting, which is the cultivation of intellectual character. And I think other conceptions of intellectual character development, like critical thinking skills, are problematic. So someone like Harvey Siegel says, no, don't go for virtues, go for critical thinking skills. The idea is educating for virtues entails educating critical thinking skills, but not vice versa. This might be a more minimal way of thinking about character education. But what seems problematic about that is it's really important, it seems to me, to the good that we get from education, that you're cultivating this love and desire for truth. you can develop critical thinking skills completely independently of that. I mean, think about your training. You can train up a bunch of lawyers to be really good lawyers. They're great in the courtroom. You know, they argue well, they win their case and so on. But maybe you don't give them that desire for truth. And so they don't care about that. Maybe all they care about is, you know, winning cases or maybe looking good, esteeming their colleagues or something like that. Something I think we would say has been missed from an educational perspective in a practice of that kind, which really goes for critical thinking skills. There's a related point here as well, which is more philosophical. A lot of our conceptions of education, they come to us from the Romantic period, so the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that's not coincidental because a lot of the public higher institutions of higher education started to be founded around that time. And so you have the big thinkers of the day appealing to romantic ideals. I mean, we think of the Romantic period primarily as, you know, the artists, but one of the ideals of the Romantic period is like the dignity of the universal dignity of persons and what it means to respect that dignity and how to enable people to live fruitful and good lives. An idea very influential on Marx, that says how. So you get them, in the light of that, educational figures like von Humboldt, helped design the Prussian education system, and in turn was very influential on particularly German and Austrian higher education, coming up with a conception of what higher education should be, where it's meant to respect the dignity of the person by helping them to be epistemically autonomous. And this is cast in terms of helping them cultivate intellectual character. We shouldn't think of higher education as simply about subject-specific knowledge and skills. We should think of it more broadly in terms of cultivation of the dignified intellectual person. Same idea is found in John Henry Newman in his essay on the idea of a university. I think a lot of people, which in turn was influential on British and Irish education systems, I think a lot of people don't read Newman's work on the university because they think, oh, he's a big Catholic figure, and in fact, he's now he's a saint, he's been canonized, so he's gone all the way up, as it were. So
impressive career.
Because they feel, well, he'll just be talking about religious education, but actually, it's quite the opposite. He says that a university has to have this moral and religious mission. It must always be secondary. I think he says tertiary. I think something else secondary. I don't know what that is. The primary goal of higher education, he says, is the cultivation of intellectual character. And then writing a bit later, you get similar ideas in Dewey. He talks about, you know, active knowers and, you know, the dignity of. He thinks democratic ideals of education can only really be fulfilled if you have an education system that is structured about developing character and autonomy. I'm not denying, by the way, that there are differences between these three figures. I'm just saying there's commonality, at least on this point. So there's this liberatory conception of education, and it goes hand in hand with the idea that education is about educating for virtuous intellectual character, and not just about educating for the lower level skills and knowledge. And I think all of us on some level recognize that's what we're doing when we're in the classroom. I think, you know, we don't just want to fill up those buckets. We want to, you know, inspire people. We want them to have a care and concern for the truth, help them to be good inquirers themselves. So here's my Pollyanna vision then. Education is going to be radically transformed by AI, but hopefully the positive takeout from this could be that we'll come to recognize, or bring back to the fore, a conception of education that I think has been atrophying, which is that there's more to education than just doing the kinds of things that can be offloaded to AI. So we have to recognize the dumbness of the AI, the sense in which it's dumb, the sense in which we're intelligent, and the sense in which education is geared towards the latter rather than the former. And the one last thing I'm going to read that out. The last thing I want to say is that, you know, some of this is happening already, and you know, as it happens, some of this is happening right here. UCI, the Anti to Virtues project that I run, that's precisely about trying to bring educating the virtuous intellectual character back into the UCI curriculum. If you were at Jason Bear's talk yesterday, there's some high schools nearby. There's a high school and middle school nearby in Long Beach, again, for educating the virtuous intellectual character right back into the heart of the curriculum. So people are doing this. And I think the urgency of doing this, you know, it's going to increase as the AI starts to encroach. And if we don't actually do something about this and start getting, you know, making clear that this is what education is about, then disaster will ensue. All right, thank you.
Almost a quarter of an hour Q&A. Yuval, then Kenny, and then Tiffany, and then let's see. Okay, Yuval.
I have so many friends in the room that I feel I can ask a politically charged question and not get murdered. But here's how I see, and I want to pose this as a question to you. So as a faculty member at a small liberal arts college, teaching Claremont, as a parent of kids going through a couple of, actually 3 different systems, elementary, junior high, et cetera, it seems to me that the going model for education that I see is actually not the bucket conception, although that's there when you look at discussions of education in the media. I agree that's what it looks like. Can you acquire sort of skills and knowledge that will help you make money or whatever? What I see rather is an advocacy activist model of education, where you're supposed to train people to do something in society. And of course, there's different versions of this. So depending on probably where in the country you live. But I see this in elementary, junior high, high school, and college. And I see it as the main view, the mainstream view among educators. How do you think, well, number one, you can say, okay, you've had a weird trajectory through the system, and that's not the way it is. I think you have more data about it than I do. But if I'm anywhere near right about that, how does that interact with the intellectual virtues? I mean, how does training someone to be an activist or to be an advocate or to sort of be a partisan of this or that political movement or ideology or social movement, how does that interact with, I mean, is that a version of training for an intellectual virtue? Because you're teaching someone to be X, Y, and Z, and then you fill it out? Or is this just as antithetical to training someone in the intellectual virtues as the bucket conception is?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, certainly I would say this, activist style education, if it's not done, at the very least ought to be done in concert with educated virtues, intellectual character, or it's going to have a problem. When we selected the 4, we focused on 4, the anti virtues, we focused on 4. And they're chosen very deliberately. 2 of them are chosen because they complement each other and they speak to this concern. It's intellectual humility and intellectual tenacity. The reason why they complement them is I think a lot of students get to university and they think, for example, that to have conviction is to refuse to listen to people you disagree with. So if you're willing to engage with someone, that must mean you don't really have conviction. And we try to get them to see the virtue of intellectual tenacity is not to be understood that way. And relatedly, to get them to see that it being, one way of thinking about intellectual humility might be as a kind of civility. You just sort of downgrade yourself. You're not confident in what you believe. Even the things that you've thought about a lot and they're deeply cherished to you. Again, we try and explain to them intellectual humility is not like that. You can be completely convinced of something, but you can still manifest your intellectual humility by how you engage with the others, by being open to the other people's ideas. That's the heart of intellectual humility. So the thought is that, there's a kind of, if you just educate for activism without the intellectual virtues, I think you're going to end up with vices. And they're going to be pernicious vices because as vices tend to do, they're going to put you in a downward spiral, as it were, because you're less likely to acquire the virtues the more you exhibit the vices. So whether it's true in general activism, I mean, I've heard that said. It's not been my experience with my kids. I mean, they don't seem to care about anything except
Grades.
Great. They care about grades. They care about careers. They're focused on STEM and business. They don't care about the arts. It's really astonishing to me, and they're really obsessed with their grades and GPA. So, but that may be just Irvine. Maybe that's just
Uni high.
It's maybe, one more thing I'll say, by the way, because I forgot to mention the talk. Another reason you should educate virtuous intellectual character is it works. We have the project we do isn't just a curriculum project and a theoretical project; it's an empirical project. All the data shows that, like, even if you just think of this from a, like an instrumentalist point of view, educational outcomes are improved across the board if you educate virtuous intellectual character. There's lots of evidence. I mean, of course, early stages of evidence, but we're doing onto a longitudinal thing now. So, but we've got papers showing demonstrated effects. People who've educated versions of virtues versus people who haven't, and improved educational outcomes. So, just from a pragmatic point of view, that's one way to make the case for this.
Ken?
Yeah, so so in your discussion of why large language models are doing something different from humans, in your discussion of behavioral modernity, you were saying that that there's at least this idea that that Chomsky has that there's this distinctive linguistic faculty playing an important role here. Now, I know that some people have argued against this idea. So the anthropologist Joe Henrich argues that actually the secret of our success, as his book title says, is the fact that humans do just copy, and that unlike apes, we don't try to understand what the person's doing, we just do it. And that we, as a result, develop all these unique cultural adaptations to the environments and communities that we're in.
Yeah.
And that and the linguist Piantadosi has argued that sort of the Chomskyan program over the decades has made lots of incremental progress on creating things that behave something like human language, but nowhere near as successful as what the large language models have done through their imitation. And it makes me wonder, like, so I think, to me, I mean, the way I interpret a lot of this is that there's a sort of human society from behavioral modernity up until around the 17th through 18th century had was based on a certain kind of intellectual virtue of deferring to your elders and deferring to experienced community members and copying. And then since the Enlightenment, we've developed this set of this conflicting set of virtues, these ideas, or at least the idea that intellectual autonomy and things like that are the more core virtues. And I see a lot of conflict about these two things in the contemporary epistemological literature that we have. There is a major strand praising autonomy, but then there's also major strand with like John Hardwick talking about epistemic dependence and Elijah Milgram talking about the growth of specialization, meaning that we all have to defer to others in these major ways. And I'm just wondering, how do you see these things?
Yeah, great. There's a lot there. On the anti-Chomsky, just a little bit of background. When I was back at Edinburgh, I ended up having quite a large managerial role, which I never wanted in the school.
Yeah.
And unlike like here with the dean, I've never had a philosophical conversation with the dean. I'm talking about administrative things, but that's not what you do. You talk about donors and stuff.
Yeah.
In Britain and a lot of other places, when you have a senior role, you're expected to be part of the research culture of the school. Our school was philosophy, psychology, and linguistics. And one of the big things they have there is the Centre for Language Evolution, which is known colloquially as the Anti-Chomsky Centre. There's Jeff Pullum and people like that. These people hate Chomsky. I mean, it's visceral. And every week I go along these talks, every week there'd be an anti-Chomsky speaker. And when I first started going, well, I didn't have any skin in this game. I just came out with mine. And each talk progressively convinced me that Chomsky was right. I came out there as a complete convert. So I know there are these anti-Chomsky things, but the more I got into it, the more I was convinced. But yeah, you should know that there is some dissent about this. Yeah, and then on the autonomy versus dependence, I mean, yes, there is this apparent tension. I mean, I have views about this, which take us too far afield to go into, but I think what's gone wrong there is you have to understand these intellectual virtues the right way. Just as I was saying a moment ago. So a lot of people in epistemology think that if you stick to your opinions in the face of a vote like peer disagreement, that is thereby to be dogmatic and therefore adviseful. And I think that's simply a mistake. Because what's important is not that you change your opinions, it's that how you engage. It's like the art of focusing. So I think you can resolve a lot of these apparent tensions if you get the right conceptualization of terms involved.
But do you think this affects this characterization of what the large language models are doing as essentially different? I mean, now maybe I guess if you're accepting the Chomskyan idea, then it's.
Yeah, I don't think they're like I say, they're just mimicking us. They're not. They're not doing what they seem to be doing. They seem to be doing it because they're mimicking us. Yeah.
Tiffany?
Yeah, so I was wondering if you think that there's ways for large language models to develop that could help develop intellectual virtues, right? So one thing being maybe asking questions. So, yeah.
So this is, so to show you how it's in progress, we have this project, such as in education. We are one of the spin-off projects in Anti Virtues, which Sharon's leading, is thinking about AI and intellectual virtues and how they relate to one another. And one question you might have there is how, so the short answer is yes, how might you use the technology to help cultivate? I mean, not that that's central to what we're doing, we're more interested in how people with intellectual virtues use AI. But once you start to understand how intellectual virtues and AI intersect, then you can start to think about ways the technology could be adapted. So maybe it stimulates you to ask questions at certain junctures, or maybe it detects when you're leaping. Maybe make sure that you are opposed. You consider opposing views for making judgments or something like that. You can think of lots of ways it could have that kind of effect, and you could engineer it. But it would just be a tool, right? It wouldn't be as it were your human intelligence has just been offloaded to the AI. It's just something which is helping you to enhance it.
So Alicia and Sylvia, please keep it brief so that we can finish in the next 3 or 4 minutes. Thanks. Sorry.
So I had a question. Paulo Freire has, in his influential book, Pedagogy of the Press, he argues that the West utilizes something called a banking system of education, where students are treated as like empty receptacles where you deposit information and it's transactional and you can withdraw that information, they can recite it, regurgitate it. I wondered how that might differ from the bucket system of education that you used.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I haven't really. I need to go back and look at Freire. I mean, he's a bit more radical than the people I mentioned there, in the sense that he's tying this, he's tying his critique of education to a very explicitly Marxist perspective. Whereas I think the other three, I mean, Dewey, of course, a socialist, so I guess he's not a million miles away. What all 4 figures, including Freire, had this idea of education done well ought to be liberatory. Is his negative description same as the bucket? I don't know. It probably has affinities. I'd have to go back and have a look.
I was thinking the same thing. I think it's quite close, except maybe remove some political dimension to it.
Yeah, my question was actually already asked. It was about the role of AI in training intellectual virtues, and I think there's a lot to say about that, but yeah.
Yeah, so if I can just take a minute, like you have kids in the school system, and like you, I see that they defer to AI quite a lot because the kind of things they're asked to do in school invite that most of the time. I also see that sometimes teachers are not there to teach and give them videos to watch in class instead of being there to engage them in some more human way. I'm actually a little bit worried about the fact that the increase, the use of AI for all sorts of purposes I don't even want to mention, is actually depriving them not only of certain character traits, which may be useful and important for their flourishing as human beings, but also very basic abilities or forms of know-how or skills that may not be the whole story of education, but certainly and still are part of it, like learning how to read words that are longer than 5 letters. That's a concern if you have kids in this kind of system nowadays where they are, or reasoning through certain mathematical problems that are not particularly difficult, but at least, if you engage in the exercise, you develop certain kinds of skills and so on and so forth. Examples could be multiplied. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about the interplay, not only of AI and the intellectual virtues, but also the skills that are part of what we take to be our skill set as human beings, adults that are capable of navigating the world somewhat autonomously.
I think it's why in-person teaching, small group in-person teaching, is always the most effective way to teach. I mean, obviously, for various reasons, you have to have large-scale teaching for certain classes, but most education systems at some point will do that. And I think the reason for it is that you need someone who can model the intellectual virtues, and that's how people learn to acquire it. I'll just say a little bit about this project I was involved in back in Scotland, which is a prison education project. And what we did was we had men's prison, women's prison, and then we were doing basically critical thinking type challenges with them. But we were kind of doing it, we called it that, it was really educated virtuous intellectual character. But I think it was less in prison if we said that, so we still couldn't. And then at the beginning, really, it was at men's prison, for example, at the beginning, very hierarchical. Some people speak, some people don't. Some people listen to, some, in fact, no one was really listening to anyone else. And they were just completely unable to engage with what we were doing. We were setting a critical thinking puzzle. What was interesting was not can they solve them, but how do they go about doing it? And then we train them up. There was this methodology where we trained them up in critical thinking, and then each week we'd set them different puzzles, and then we'd see the differences. And what was striking to me was by the end, this hierarchical system, it would become completely different. Now everyone's talking to one another. It's suddenly horizontal. Everyone's engaging. People are listening to one another. They're correctly they're coming up with proposals on how to solve things, and someone else might come up with another proposal. But they've obviously listened to, thought about all that. So there's a kind of a spirit of collaboration. It was a much more democratic unit by the end. And I thought this was a really interesting example of how that kind of teaching, which is very much targeted on character. I mean, we're focused on intellectual character, but if you improve character at all, character is so holistic, it improves character as a whole. I think they were better people by the end. They were more interested in each other. They had social skills they didn't have at the beginning and so on. So I think that kind of teaching, that was kind of like education in its purest form, because it wasn't subject specific at all.
Yeah.
It was just thinking about thinking, but it had a transformative effect precisely because it was, you were modeling certain kinds of character traits, and they, through modeling it and getting them to model it with you, they were sort of basically acquiring them themselves.
Fine, thank you, Duncan. Good luck. Okay.